The H3000 was a modern take to steam locomotives due to the sharply rising costs of diesel fuel, and Ross Brownings believed that steam was scrapped too soon and had more power than diesels.
But unfortunately, yet mysteriously, while in the Indian Ocean, the ship carrying the locomotive capsized, taking the engine with it.
On the Modoc northern siding south of the main town and closer north to the Oregon-California border lies 11 almost neglected steam locomotives.
Boston and Maine plus New Haven merger. In 1907, the New Haven Railroad proposed merging with the Boston and Maine as the Northeastern Railroad was expanding northward and purchasing nearby railroads and streetcar lines thanks to banking from J.P. Morgan. However, future Associate Justice of the Supreme Court Louis D. Brandeis filed a lawsuit against the New Haven for antitrust violations and questioned its financial conditions. These points were proven true, and the portions of the B&M which the New Haven purchased were sold off. It's also important to note that this attempted merger occurred during the Progressive Era, which involved numerous attempts to break up monopolies and trusts, so it's not surprising that this proposal was met with much opposition due to the proposed system establishing an unjust monopoly in the Boston region. The 5 American QJ210-2s. According to an anonymous connection who has ties with the Iowa Interstate Railroad, the original plan was to import 5 QJ210-2s from China to the United States, and not just have 1 or 2 of them to be parts donors to keep the yards running, but to have all 5 of them running at the same time. Only 6988 and 7081 ever made it to Iowa though, with a third later being bought by R.J. Corman for use on excursions, becoming R.J. Corman 2010. 2010 was possibly part of the batch of 5 that were meant to come to the States, and the other 2 are assumed to have been scrapped after a buyer couldn't be found. Otherwise, only 3 Datong-built China Railways QJs are on American soil: Iowa Interstate 6988 and 7081, and R.J. Corman 2008. C&O 2716 on the Clinchfield Railroad. 20 years after the C&O retired number 2716, the Clinchfield leased it for its steam program. Restoration of the locomotive began in 1979, but plans for the locomotive's excursions were suspended when Seaboard Coastline Industries, the parent company of the Clinchfield, ousted the railroad's general manager over misappropriated money, which resulted in the disassembled 2716 being returned to the Kentucky Railway Museum. Restoration work would continue for this locomotive soon thereafter by the Southern Railroad in order to meet increasing demand for their own steam program. This term could also refer to another event which happened almost 40 years later, when 2716 was moved from the Kentucky Railway Museum to Ravenna, Kentucky in 2019. This move was led by Clinchfield F7 number 800, the very same locomotive which led it in 1979, but this move was not on Clinchfield trackage. UP 844 and SP 4449 traveling to Vancouver for Expo 86. As the first railway exposition in Canada since 1964, and the first major exhibition since the Chicago Railroad Fair of 1949, Vancouver's Steam Expo of 1986, also known as Expo 86, was a significant gathering of Canadian-American locomotives for railfans and tourists to enjoy. Original plans for the festival called for Union Pacific 844 and Southern Pacific 4449 to be there for the Grand Parade of Steam. However, this was later cancelled due to a lack of enthusiasm from Burlington Northern, and the state of Oregon was not paying for promotions for 4449. This would have been the second time in only 2 years the 2 famous locomotives would have been together, with the last time being in New Orleans between May 12th and November 11th, 1984. While 844 was there on site, 4449 simply visited the fair on a round-trip excursion between Portland and New Orleans, totaling a whopping 7,477 miles, the longest a steam locomotive excursion has run to date. Later in 1986, 4449 would be a part of filming Tough Guys and operate business trains across the Southern Pacific system. Paulson Spence's Louisiana Eastern becoming a railroad museum. From the looks of this proposed railroad, it definitely should have been that. Holstein Spence was an entrepreneur who had patented steam valves. In 1947, he owned a gravel business with a spur using retired steam locomotives. He would then take this railroad as the basis for his system, the Louisiana Eastern. Throughout the 1950s, Spence would collect more and more steam locomotives, eventually having over 30 steam engines on his roster. Unfortunately, his plans would collapse after his passing in 1961. Today, only 4 engines owned by the LE remain. Numbers 1, 2, 4, and 98 all survived the scrapper's torch. Number 1 is at the Southeastern Railway Museum in Duluth, Georgia. 2 is at the Three Rivers Rambler in Knoxville, Tennessee. 4 is at the Reading Blue Mountain Northern in Port Clinton, Pennsylvania. And 98 is at the Wilmington and Western in Wilmington, Delaware. The number of surviving F-45s. The EMD F-45 is a freight cal unit which was purchased by the Santa Fe, Great Northern, and Burlington Northern, with the Santa Fe being the last Class 1 to operate them until their retirement in the mid-1990s. But since so many railroads held on to these locomotives even towards the 21st century, there are likely a lot more in storage, mainly from roads like the New York, Susquehanna Western, and Montana Rail Link. Depending on what the year was, the number of surviving F-45s was constantly questioned. One F-45, Great Northern 441, is soundly preserved as the world's only locomotive converted into a lodge at the Isaac Walton Inn, while 2 Wisconsin Central F-45s are stored at LTEX in McDonald, Ohio, with a very uncertain future. As recently as 2021, a 4th F-45 was spotted for the first time in nearly a decade as GECX 5989 was converted by the Union Pacific as a maintenance unit. Or at least those were the plans for the locomotive. Alternative nose cone designs for the P-40. While the General Electric P-40 Genesis was in planning in the early 1990s, alternative nose cones designs were drawn up for the locomotive. Some of these had a more angled or more streamlined and curved front end, more closely resembling European trains like the TGV and Ice and the Class 390 Pendolino. Ultimately, they chose and stuck with the smaller, curved nose cone that we all know today, but it's interesting to think what might have been had they chosen a different design. Unfortunately, I was unable to find these sketches mentioned, but I was able to find a 2005 proposal for a new generation of Genesis locomotives, so this entry could be referring to this sketch as well. Nickel Plate 765's canceled excursion to Galesburg, Illinois. Between 2016 and 2018, the Fort Worth Historical Society teamed up with Metra for NKP 765 to pull excursions. The first train in June 2016 was called the Varsity and ran between North Glenview and Janesville, Wisconsin. There were soon plans for an excursion known as the Galesburg Zephyr from Chicago's Union Station to Galesburg, Illinois, in a partnership with Amtrak to celebrate the 39th anniversary of the Galesburg Railroad Days event. However, this trip was cancelled only a month before its scheduled run on June 25th and 26th, with FWRHS citing low ticket sales for the trip as a reason in order to protect the financial future of 765 and the organization. Unbuilt variations of the GE-7 and -8. While there are -7 and -8 concepts that we know of that weren't built, there were models that also only had one unit built. One of them was the -836B, or the B36-8. General Electric number 606 was the only B36-8 unit built in the original -8 prototype. That's the only one that has had one single unit built, none more than that. There were some types that had very low quantities built, like the BQ23-7 and C32-8s. The full list of unbuilt or non-purchased GEs include the B18-7, -832C, U33CG, U18C, U56, U18BT, U15BT, U33CG, B40-8B, C23-7, B28-7, C28-7, B23-8, B33-7, and C33-7. NDM buying Japanese electric locomotives. There's an issue of Extra 2200, a news periodical about locomotives. Basically, this is how Railfans communicated before the internet. And sometime around 1971 or 72, there were rumors going around that the NDM was considering purchasing Japanese electric locomotives. I was not able to find the exact model of the Japanese electric locomotive, nor was I able to find concept art, but I can infer that this was likely the JNR Class EF71, based on it being a Japanese 6-axle AC traction locomotive built around the mid-1970s. However, the railroad ended up buying E60Cs from GE, which were later used for the Black Mesa and Lake Powell. Illinois Central's H24-66 Trainmasters. In the 1950s, the Illinois Central tested a Fairbanks Morse H24-66 Trainmaster and was impressed by its great performance. Seeing the increasing popularity of the locomotive model on other roads, The Illinois Central had plans to order a total of 75 trainmasters, but this was cancelled due to a proxy fight at FM, which likely estranged the Illinois Central as they never rostered an FM locomotive, and instead purchased CMD GP7s. If this purchase will have gone through, there is much speculation that the trainmasters, and possibly other FM products, would have been preserved and rebuilt, and would still be running today based on the high quality of Paducah rebuilds.
Conrail's GP60Ms and SD70 Max. Around late 1993 or early 1994, Conrail placed an order for 26 GP60MIs, which are GP60Ms but with the isolated cab. And they placed an order for 4 SD70 Max and, although not listed here, 4 AC4400 CWs. Unfortunately, the orders were cancelled and changed to 21 SD80 Max, which soon increased to 28. This was covered in a volume of the Extra 2200 South magazine, which was previously mentioned on the NDEM Buying Japanese Electric Locomotives entry in the above layer. Conrail later purchased 15 SD70 Max in 1998, but these engines were transferred to CSX when they acquired Conrail only a year later. N&W SD40 1580. N&W SD40 1580 is Norfolk & Western's first SD40 locomotive. It was built by EMD in May of 1966 and proudly served all the way into the Norfolk Southern days before being retired in 2008. Norfolk Southern, realizing the importance of the locomotive, tried to make it another living heritage unit alongside 1700 in Erie Lackawanna paint and 3170 in the Southern Railway tuxedo scheme, and donated it to the Virginia Transportation Museum. But unfortunately, the plan fell through and the railroad never got its third living heritage unit. It is likely still sitting in Juniata as of when this video was made. The total number of surviving EMC rail cars in whole or otherwise. While there are a lot of Australian EMC rail cars still preserved, there are 6 scattered around America. Montana Western M31 is preserved at the Mid-Continent Railway Museum. Union Pacific M35 is at the Illinois Railway Museum. Tonopah and Tidewater M99 is preserved on the Mexican Railway. Yes, that's in the US. Santa Fe M177 is at the Traveltown Railway Museum. Erie Railroad M5012 is at the Ohio Railway Museum in Worthington, Ohio. And finally, Santa Fe M190, the last EMC rail car produced, is at Belen, New Mexico. The other 10 are in different parts of Australia. Of course, there's also all of the preserved Burlington train sets, including the ones mentioned earlier. Milwaukee Road 6402 doing 100 miles per hour before the Flying Scotsman. On July 20th, 1934, Milwaukee Road Class F6 6402 participated in a test run to prove the feasibility of a high-speed service, which was launched as the Hiawatha service in 1935 between Chicago and Milwaukee. Times were taken with a stopwatch as each station was passed, and in addition, the locomotive was fitted with a speedometer. This recorded the speed on a chart, indicating a maximum of 103.5 miles per hour, or 166.6 kilometers an hour, was reached. But timetable claims between stations doubt this claim, and some are just deciding to believe it's just a pure press story or a fake report. GTW 5629 on the Southern Railway. This is partially true. When 5629 was stored on a Penn Central siding near 16th Street, the Southern Railway approached Richard Jensen with an offer for the locomotive. Jensen was surprised at the amount given, as it was nowhere near what he thought the locomotive was. Unfortunately, with any private deal, the amount hasn't been disclosed yet. It could have been higher or lower than what Jensen imagined. My money's on it being lower. Ann Arbor being included in the Conrail merger. Well, kind of. It had a grip on Ann Arbor from its inception on April 1st, 1976, up until a year later in 1977, when the Michigan Interstate Railroad took over Ann Arbor and sold it off to several short lines. During that time, 10 of Ann Arbor's GP35s, 385 to 394, were renumbered to 3610 to 3619. Unfortunately, these locomotives wouldn't officially join the roster and remain in AA hands. The Ann Arbor Railroad would soon be revitalized in 2013 as a rod coat railroad. The Grand Canyon Railway's Chinese locomotives. When the Grand Canyon Railway was formed as a tourist railroad in the 1980s, they were looking at bringing over steam locomotives from China. Although this is unconfirmed, they were likely going to reclaim U.S. Army S-160s that had migrated to China, classified as China Railways KD-6. Unfortunately, these plans were rejected by China, so the Grand Canyon members went to their backup plan, which was to have a look at Lake Superior and Ishpeming 280s that had been working in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. They bought 4 of the LS&I 280s, specifically numbers 18, 19, 20, 29, and the rest is history. Grand Trunk Western 080-8305's actual owner. Grand Trunk Western 8305, or Northwestern Steel and Wire 5, was built in June of 1924 and served the GTW until May of 1960 when a 2-in-1 special happened. The first transfer of ownership was to a steel company by the name of Lyria Steel and Trading, but a few days later the locomotive would find itself with more of its buddies at Northwestern Steel and Wire and was simply numbered down to 05. It would serve under the NSW name before the railroad donated the locomotive to the Illinois Railway Museum in January of 1982. Today, the locomotive resides in relatively decent condition in the small town of Galton, Illinois, with the tender gone to Quincy for restoration. The Hicks Car Works, which primarily documents histories on interurbans as well as give updates on the Illinois Railway Museum's electric car department, shows that 8305 is still owned by the Illinois Railway Museum. The IRM already owned sister engine 8380, as well as the cab for another GTW 080, possibly for 8320, but 8305 hasn't been moved to the museum and it's unknown if it ever will. The Germans knew about the Union Pacific Big Boy. This is as true as it gets. During World War II, Germany did know about the Big Boy, likely due to reports from spies, which goes to show the locomotive's reach in terms of fame. Nothing that big would ever go unnoticed, even from the eyes of European rulers. There's also speculation that the Germans had plans to make a similar locomotive, just as powerful as the Union Pacific Big Boy, by using details from the original. Groups trying to save BN SD70 MAC 9400 for preservation. In the late 2010s, with the introduction of PSR, Burlington Northern Santa Fe has been sidelining and retiring a lot of their older locomotives, including the SD70 MACs. Burlington Northern 9400 was the very first SD70 MAC built by EMD, and BN's first of a fleet that would number well over 300 plus units, and would continue to arrive on the property even after the BNSF merger. The unit was heavily promoted by BN when it was brand new, as it was a big deal to them, but the locomotive has been stored in Donkey Creek Yard in Wyoming. Reportedly, various groups and individuals had been asking BNSF to donate or preserve the unit, but BNSF refused, stating they weren't in a position to make, quote, charitable donations at the time. Southern Railway 3170 going to NCTM. Between May 9th and 10th, 2015, 3170 visited the NCTM as NS's Goodwill Ambassador. She wouldn't only visit the NCTM, as she went to a couple of other museums around the southeastern states, such as the Southeastern Railway Museum in Duluth, Georgia, almost 3 months after NCTM, between August 1st and 2nd, 2015. After her run around Southern Train Museum, she finally settled at the Tennessee Valley Railroad Museum in Chattanooga, Tennessee, operating there until early 2017, when mechanical issues threw her out of service and put her on display at Grand Junction Station. Chicago and Northwestern's final locomotives. The Chicago and Northwestern is remembered for its use of second-hand locomotives from other roads, such as the Chicago Great Western, for example. But the final locomotives that the railroad would purchase first-hand would be 35 GE AC 4400 CWs, numbered 8801 to 8835, all being built during 1994. And just a year later, the Union Pacific would acquire the Chicago and Northwestern, absorbing it entirely in their system. All of the C&W AC 4400s can still be found roaming the Union Pacific today, even though they have since been repainted. C&J 774 being preserved. Built by Baldwin in 1913, C&J 774 was a 460 and one of C&J's plentiful fleet of camelback locomotives. In 1955, the locomotive was retired due to the ongoing dieselization movement. Railfans, knowing how significant the locomotive was, tried to have it preserved. A group in Atlantic City was attempting to preserve the 774 as it was the last Central New Jersey camelback in operation. The C&J refused to simply donate the locomotive as they just donated 592 to the B&O Railroad Museum and wanted the group to pay scrap value for it. The group couldn't afford C&J's price tag and the engine was scrapped. Years later, F. Nelson Blount, Steamtown's founder, said that if he'd known they wanted to preserve it, he could have been in Atlantic City the next day with his checkbook. The only surviving part of 774 is its number plate, which is in the hands of Don Wood. Where the number plate is located is currently unknown. South American exports. E&D and GE have made several export train models for railroads in South America, but sometimes those same export models would sometimes have copies that would stay on home soil for some reason. One such unit, Texas Industries G8 number 208-1, is on sale in Boulder, Colorado. Originally, this unit wouldn't specifically go to South America, but to Canadian National as number 7671. It would then be renumbered to 8051, which it carries on its lighted number boards, despite being numbered as 208-1. Going in the other direction, a number of North American locomotives have been exported to South America, and many of them are now rare and exotic locomotives, which are scarce or no longer exist in the United States. A number of C-39-8s from both Norfolk Southern and Conrail have been shipped to Brazil, along with the Burlington Northern C-30-7. All of the surviving ex-Milwaukee Road SDL-39s have been shipped to Brazil, along with various SD-40-2s, SD-45s, and even SD-40T-2 tunnel motors. Many of these locomotives have been rebuilt with rather odd truck arrangements to help fit the lighter loading gauge down south.
Unused American Freedom Train candidates. One of the most famous cancelled AFT locomotives was Norfolk and Western J-Class number 611. For the AFT, it would lose its streamlining and have a more conventional look. Sadly, due to unknown reasons, the idea was scrapped, and all we have of the concept being actively thought about is the art by Bob Lorenz. But the engine would be used to be the logo for the AFT itself, for advertising purposes. Other candidates included NKB Berkshire's 755 and 763, and ATSF's 2925. 755 is currently based at the Conneaut Railroad Museum in Conneaut, Ohio. 763 is at the H-Steam Roundhouse in Sugar Creek, Ohio, and Santa Fe 2925 is at the California State Railroad Museum in Sacramento. Catskill Mountain Railway importing an S-160 back home from China. There was a magazine article for a railway preservation news publication. They did articles on the Union Pacific Executive E9s and Pennsylvania Railroad 460 in this issue, but one of the articles also shows and talks about steam locomotives running in China, and it implies and maybe even mentions that the Catskill Mountain Railway was trying to import a KD-7, what the USRA S-160 was reclassified as in China, back to the States. There is much more information on it because this was just briefly mentioned in a caption for a photo of a Chinese steam locomotive lined up next to each other, and one of them being an S-160, although I myself couldn't find any further information on the topic. Hartwell Railway's SD-38-2 being preserved. The Hartwell Railway has an ex-EJ&E SD-38 number 654. It was built in January 1970 and came to the railroad in early August 2010. But when most other Hartwell Railway locomotives would be rotting away, 654 stood out as a clean locomotive with little spots of rust on the engine. This led to Railfans believing that a preservation group, unbeknownst to the public, was keeping the locomotives as clean as it was. But I'm pretty sure that was on the fake side of things, but it was no surprise that rumors surfaced of the SD-38-2 being offered to a museum, but was turned down for unknown reasons. If any of these plans were to work, then 654 would be the first SD-38 in preservation. Ross Rawlins 21st Century Limited. For 4 years, Ross held the idea of a steam-powered exhibition train about most of the major accomplishments of the 20th century before the next century hit the world. The main motive power would be Chesty Safety Express star Chesapeake and Ohio J38 Northern 614 and New York Central Mohawk 3001, the main candidate for the canceled Conrail steam program. In addition to these conventional steam locomotives, there was also a proposal to have a 4,000 horsepower GE power car. Behind them, a train as long and as similar as the American Freedom Train, showing off man's greatest achievement during the 1900s. But the idea was started all the way in 1991. Even though this would seem like enough time, the time itself was running too short with little progress by 1996, and the project was scrapped in its entirety as the 20th century would come to a close without the 21st century limited. Standard gauge German locomotives in the United States during World War II. During or after World War II, 4 steam locomotives were brought over by the US military to try and study German engineering. I know, I thought they would be war souvenirs too. The engines brought over were V19-1001, DRV-52s 2006 and 3674, the latter having a condensing tender, and DRV-42-1597. These locomotives, along with a small diesel shunting locomotive, were being used to train military personnel on how to operate steam locomotives in Europe. All 4 would later be used as hard targets for training purposes and never return home. Although, Deutsche Bundesbahn was offered to buy back the one-of-a-kind V19, but since they had no demand for high-speed locomotives, the offer was rejected as all 4 locomotives were later scrapped. Now that I think about it, they would be considered war souvenirs. Too bad there wasn't a preservation effort done for these specific foreign engines. At least we have a plentiful amount of Henshaw locomotives scattered around America. CNW restoring Milwaukee Road 265 for excursion service. At some point in the 1980s, the Chicago and Northwestern approached the Illinois Railway Museum with a deal that would put Milwaukee Road 265, the only other S3 Northern to survive the Cutter's torch, back on the main line. They did conduct a feasibility study for the locomotive and concluded that the engine was the perfect candidate for the railroad's future steam program. But when they approached them, and after the IRM's careful consideration, they politely turned the project down, crushing the hopes and dreams of many who wanted to see the locomotive in action. Southern Railway 4501 on the Loops, 2010s. In the 2010s, Norfolk Southern launched their 21st Century Steam program with Southern Railway 4501, Southern Railway 630, and Nickel Plate 765 taking to the main line across the system, and eventually being joined by Norfolk and Western 611. 611 ran a fan trip on the Southern Railway main line along the Asheville Loops, with the Southern Railway Heritage Unit 8099 and North Carolina Transportation Museum's Southern Railway FP7 tagging along for the ride. A story has surfaced that this trip was actually meant to be pulled by the 4501, but due to conflicts between Norfolk Southern and the Tennessee Valley Railway Museum, 611 was put on the train instead. Nothing further is known beyond that, and it may be best to keep it that way out of respect for NSN-TVRM. While 4501 never went on the Old Fort Loops during the 21st Century Steam program, the only other Southern steam locomotive that did run the loops was 630, a K-class built by Alco in 1904. Other than that, normal NS trains ran across the loops until May 1st, 2020, when Norfolk Southern idled the hump yard at Linwood, ending 41 years of busy traffic on the Southern trackage. Pennsylvania Railroad 4483 restoration and moving to Strasburg. This is by far one of the most controversial things that rail fans have heard to date. Pennsylvania 4483 is the sole surviving Pennsy I-1 class of decapods. Since 1982, it has been put under the hands of the Western New York Railway Historical Society, but sometime in 2017, there were rumors that the WNY-RHS was in talks with Strasburg about moving the engine to their grounds for operational restoration. Sadly, those rumors turned out to be false, and the locomotive is still stored at Hamburg, New York, albeit cosmetically restored on the site. Preserving a Conrail SD80 Mac. Yeah, no, that is fake. Would be cool, but fake. It was encouraged, however. A railway preservation news user by the name of Alexander D. Mitchell IV stated that if you want to start a Conrail SD80 Mac preservation fund, now would be the best time. But sadly, that was back on August 22, 2004, and now it could be too late to get an ex-Conrail SD80 Mac in its original form out of the scrapyard and into a preserved lifestyle. Norfolk Southern sold their remaining SD80 Macs to Progress Rail and Canadian Pacific as parts units, so the fate of these engines is looking grim. Unused chassis system special candidates. Classic Trains magazine has reported that other locomotives were being considered for the chassis system special before the chassis system ultimately settled on Reading 2101. The first proposal was to restore Chesapeake and Ohio 460 number 377, and ironically, have it tour around just the Baltimore and Ohio main line in Maryland and Virginia. The chassis system backed out, as the 337 was a bit too small for their liking, and the railroad wanted to expand the excursion to be a system-wide tour. The railroad then looked into restoring Baltimore and Ohio Pacific number 5300, George Washington, but the railroad backed out again as it was going to be very costly to restore the locomotive, and it was more than what the chassis system wanted to spend. Ultimately, Ross Rollins' Reading T1 2101 was chosen, as it was fully operable and had just come off pulling the American Freedom Train, and the rest is history.